All right, first up, I want to show you guys a little bit about Maxwell Sea. It's it's called Maxwell Sea because it's actually more inclined for doing like oceans, right? And you can stretch it out across the entire horizon. Whatever the case is, you can sort of expand it or contract it, whatever you need for your project. So what I did, and this is what a lot of you guys have, is I have this little water feature in the front of my building. I'm going to show you some sort of things not to do with it and then things to do with it. But just I want to point out real quick that this element is really just a hole in the ground. Okay, so, and it's a rather thin sheet that I created. I didn't really create mass with it. And so you'll see why, you might want to model it a different way when we get into it. So Maxwell Sea is this button right here, or you could type in Maxwell Sea and it'll come up as some of the tools. So let me put in Maxwell Sea, and you'll see this tool right here called Create Maxwell Sea. One thing I guess I probably overlooked before I got started here was you definitely need to create a new layer for this because you still have to assign it a material. So let's create one here for, we'll just call it water. I'm going to make that the active layer, and I'll go back up here to Maxwell Sea, and I'm going to do create Maxwell Sea. Now, this stuff is kind of important to understand. You have the size X, size Y, and size Z. What this is really doing is it's creating a field of points like that, right? It's basically going to be a giant grid of points, and the X and the Y are going to go like this. That's your X, that's your Y, and then your Z is going to be how high up each of these points is. So you might have some that are really low, some that are really high, which create sort of a triangulated mesh of sorts that will result in kind of a wavy sort of look to it. So you'll see when it gets in here. But in order to do this, you should approximate the size of the element that you need. And then something to note is that that Z direction is actually really kind of a finely tuned element. So I'm just going to stretch this to, let's do size X at 100 is probably okay. And size Y, I'm going to switch to 25. And my size Z, I'm just going to make that like a 1.5. And in fact, I might change that to even smaller later, but I want you to be able to see the effect. Point cloud should be fine. That's kind of what I described here before as a point cloud rather than a mesh. So then you hit enter, and it'll appear at the origin. I don't even remember where my origin is. Oh, there it is. All right. So if you look at it sort of in profile, you can see that it's doing exactly what I just described, right? Some of it's going up, some of it's going down, and it's kind of undulating across, right? It creates a texture of water. But this element needs to be placed in the location of the water feature that I created. So I'm just going to kind of manually place it to the point where it sits ever so slightly below. And sometimes it's kind of hard to tell whether or not it actually is below. So you can go here and see all of those points in elevation, and that gives you a stronger sense of whether or not it's going to actually peak up above the base level. Looks like that's about as close as I can get it. So now I'm just going to jump back here. It's showing, but I don't think that's actually going to render that way, but we'll test it. Okay, so let's do a quick test render here. It should just take a minute or two. Let me get sort of a little bit farther out on that. There we go. And let's turn on heads up. Oh, that's just set to, okay. Let me just check everything real quick. Physical sky, that's fine. Production, yeah, sure. Okay. So let's give that a minute or two to run, and then we'll discuss. All right, so continuing on, you can kind of see it on screen, but I guess what I want to point out to you real quick is that, yeah, we can see that it's undulating a little bit. There's a lot of shadow there. There's a lot of shadow there. So it looks like some of the water is lower than the rest. But we don't really have any sense that it's actually water, and that's because you still have to apply the water material. So I'm going to let that continue to run. I'm going to find an appropriate water material. So let's go to the MXM gallery, which, dear God, I hope it's still working. Okay. Ah, there we go. So I did a quick search for water. You want to be careful of this choppy water. I don't think that's what I wanted. Maybe it is what I wanted. I don't, there seems to only be one water, but there used to be more. Let's give it a shot. But I remember there was a choppy water one that didn't really render very well, but we'll try it. So I threw water on there. I'm going to set another draft render going, which I know Sean is going to hate me for, that I'm running two at once. Well, I mean, apparently, but I don't agree that that is acceptable. All right, so, and then the last thing I'm going to do here real quick is I'm grabbing these edges because you'll notice that that water sort of slipped underneath this little bridge element that I was creating, and it sort of slipped underneath the whole sidewalk as well, but that's physically impossible to do. So I'm going to make a copy of these lines. Okay, and then I'm going to extrude them, except I'm going to say solid no. And it doesn't really matter how far you pull this down, but it does need to be, you know, significant enough, right? And the reason is that's going to create this little wall that makes it look like a built element. Okay, and depending on how you detail it, you might want to do like a little recess and stuff like that. But anyway, I just wanted to show you the difference in these three types of methods. Let me make this asphalt. Actually, I'll make it sidewalk. Okay, and then I'll do one more render. Alright, so in the meantime, while those are drafting, I suggest you guys go through and start creating your first Maxwell Sea, and then I'll pause this video where it is, let it run for a few minutes, and then we'll compare those three draft renders. Are there any questions? Okay, one other thing that I think is pretty significant. If you were to create a Maxwell Sea that is smaller, generally speaking, they have the same density. So if you start with, I think if you start larger with a higher Z value and you close it, it's going to make it look like a windy water. But we'll test that out. It's been a while since I've done it. So, but you could test it out yourself if you like. Okay, so no questions? All right, have at it. Okay, guys, let's bring it back in. So we started off with a draft render that currently looks like this, right? So basically, I cut a hole, and there's no material, and it just looks like a gray surface. But as soon as you apply the material to it, it looks like this. So that's a step in the right direction, but there's still a few things wrong with it. Two things in particular. One, because it is water, it actually is translucent. So what you're seeing is the environment map beyond. Because remember, I originally cut it and there was no pit for it to sit into, right? No boundary. So that's just seeing the sky that's under the horizon below. So when I went through and I modeled this little tube for it to sit in, I gave it a wall and everything, it turned out like this, which is getting to where I want it to be. It's still like the scale of the waviness of it is still a little bit too high for what I want. I probably want to scale it down to something smaller, but that's essentially it. It's now reflecting. If you look really closely, unfortunately, it hasn't rendered enough yet, but most of this is regular water. But this little line right here is reflecting the top edge of the curb, so you can see that it's actually reflecting something that's modeled in the environment itself. So that's going to be your more accurate option for a water feature. Okay, so like Gian, for instance, you have just a plate for your pool. You're going to want to cut that plate out, and you're going to want to put like probably a 1 foot wide band of concrete or whatever around it, and then you take your sea and you drop it into it. You let it sit inside. Okay? What questions do you have about that? Can't imagine there's much at this stage. Okay, so there aren't really many specific requirements for that. Some of you have very odd shaped cuts and stuff like that, and I actually haven't done an odd shape yet. I don't know why, but I've never had a reason to, but I'm pretty sure you just need to cut the Maxwell Sea or trim it or something like that. So. But when you guys bump into that, we'll work through it together. I guess outside of that, we'll move on to something else, unless there are questions about it. Okay, cool. Yeah, what's that?
So when we cut like right now I'm looking at the whole site model, and I'm trying to cut the square so that it's like a pool. Is that what we're supposed to be doing?
Cut the square so it's like a pool. I'll come take a look at it, I think.